In the year 1896, across the rugged highlands of northern Ethiopia, two armies faced each other in a confrontation that would shatter the myth of European invincibility. On one side stood the forces of Italy, armed with modern rifles, artillery, and the unshakable confidence of a colonial power that had carved up much of Africa. On the other side, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia commanded a vast army of warriors who had marched from every corner of their ancient kingdom, united by a single burning purpose: to defend their homeland against foreign conquest. What happened at Adwa on the 1st of March, 1896, was more than just a battle. It was a moment that sent shockwaves across the entire world. An African nation had not merely resisted European colonization, it had crushed it so completely that the very foundations of colonial thinking began to crack. The victory would echo from the mountains of Ethiopia to the drawing rooms of Europe, from the villages of Africa to the newspapers of America. For the first time in the modern era, a European army had been decisively defeated by an African force on African soil. But to understand the magnitude of what happened at Adwa, we must first journey back to the world of the 1890 seconds. This was the height of what historians call the scramble for Africa. European powers had divided an entire continent among themselves, drawing lines on maps in Berlin conference rooms, carving up kingdoms and cultures as if they were slicing a cake. France had claimed vast swaths of West Africa. Britain controlled Egypt and was pushing south toward Cape Town. Germany had seized territories in East and Southwest Africa. Belgium's King Leopold had turned the Congo into his personal domain of horror. By 1896, nearly 90% of Africa had fallen under European control. The machine guns and modern rifles of the colonial powers had proven devastatingly effective against traditional African weapons. The Maxim gun, as one British poet grimly noted, gave Europeans a decisive advantage. Resistance movements had been crushed from Algeria to Zimbabwe. The great Zulu kingdom had fallen to British bullets. The Ashanti Empire had been subdued. The powerful Sokoto Caliphate was being dismantled piece by piece. Yet in the highlands of Ethiopia, something different was stirring. Here was a Christian kingdom that had existed for over 1,000 years, tracing its lineage back to the legendary Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. Here was an empire that had never been conquered, never been colonized, never bent the knee to foreign masters. The Ethiopians called their land the land of burnt faces, a place where ancient traditions and fierce independence had been forged in the crucible of mountain warfare and desert survival. At the heart of this resistance stood Menelik II, a man whose very name would become synonymous with African defiance. Born Saleh Mariam in the kingdom of Shewa, he had risen to power through a combination of political cunning, military brilliance, and an unshakable belief in Ethiopian independence. When he claimed the imperial throne in 1889, he inherited not just a crown, but a sacred trust to protect his people from the colonial tide that was washing over the continent. The stage for conflict had been set years earlier, when Italian ambitions in East Africa began to clash with Ethiopian sovereignty. Italy, the youngest of the major European powers, was desperate to claim its place in the colonial Sunday. Having been humiliated in previous attempts at expansion, Italian leaders saw the Horn of Africa as their chance to build an empire that would rival those of Britain and France. The Italians had established a foothold in Eritrea, on Ethiopia's northern coast. From there, they began to probe inland, testing Ethiopian defenses, making treaties with local rulers, and gradually extending their influence deeper into the highlands. The Treaty of Wuchale, signed in 1889, was supposed to establish friendship between Italy and Ethiopia. But there was a problem. The Italian version of the treaty claimed that Ethiopia had agreed to become an Italian protectorate, while the Amharic version made no such concession. When Menelik discovered this deception, his response was swift and uncompromising. He denounced the treaty, declared Ethiopia's complete independence, and began preparing for the war he knew would come. This was not just a dispute over diplomatic language. It was a fundamental clash between two entirely different visions of Africa's future. The Italians saw Ethiopia as another piece of territory to be absorbed into their growing empire. Menelik saw it as the last bastion of African independence, a sacred trust that must be defended at all costs. The Italian commander, General Oreste Baratieri, was a veteran of colonial warfare who had earned his reputation crushing resistance movements across Africa. He commanded a force of approximately 20,000 men, including Italian regulars, Eritrean askaris, and various colonial troops. They were armed with modern Mauser rifles, artillery pieces, and the latest military technology that European industry could provide. Most importantly, they carried with them the absolute confidence that had carried European forces to victory across the continent. But Baratieri and his officers had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that Ethiopian resistance would follow the same pattern as other African conflicts. A few quick victories, the capture of key strongholds, and the native forces would scatter before superior firepower and discipline. They had not reckoned with the unique nature of Ethiopian society, the strategic genius of Menelik II, or the determination of a people who had never known foreign rule. As tensions escalated through 1895, both sides began mobilizing for what would become one of the most significant military confrontations in African history. The Italians pushed deeper into Ethiopian territory, capturing the ancient city of Aksum and establishing forward positions in the northern highlands. Each advance was met with fierce resistance from Ethiopian forces, who used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to harass Italian supply lines and wear down their advancing columns. Menelik's response was methodical and brilliant. Rather than rushing to meet the Italian advance, he began assembling the largest army Ethiopia had ever fielded. From every province of the empire, warriors answered the call. The Shiwan cavalry rode north with their curved swords and ancient pride. The Tigrayan highlanders brought their knowledge of mountain warfare. From Gojam came fierce fighters who had never known defeat. Even the distant provinces of the south sent contingents to join what was being called a holy war for Ethiopian independence. This was not simply a feudal levy or a hastily assembled militia. Menelik had spent years modernizing his military, importing weapons from European dealers, training his officers in modern tactics, and building the infrastructure needed to supply a massive army in the field. Ethiopian merchants had traveled to Russia, France, and Italy itself, purchasing rifles, ammunition, and artillery pieces. The emperor had even established workshops where captured weapons could be repaired and ammunition manufactured. By early 1896, nearly 100,000 Ethiopian warriors had assembled in the highlands around the town of Adwa. They represented every region, every ethnic group, every religious tradition within the Ethiopian Empire. Orthodox Christians fought alongside Muslims. Highland Amhara stood shoulder to shoulder with lowland Oromo. Ancient tribal enemies had set aside their differences to face the common threat of foreign conquest. The army that gathered at Adwa was unlike anything the Italians had ever faced. This was not a collection of tribal warriors armed with spears and shields. These were disciplined soldiers, many armed with modern rifles, organized into units that combined traditional Ethiopian military structure with lessons learned from European warfare. At their head rode Menelik himself, flanked by his Empress Tetu, whose own tactical brilliance would prove crucial in the coming battle. As February turned to March, the two armies maneuvered for position in the mountainous terrain around Adwa. The Italians, confident in their superior firepower and European military doctrine, prepared for what they believed would be the final campaign to subjugate Ethiopia. The Ethiopians, united as never before in their history, readied themselves to defend not just their territory, but the very idea that Africans could govern themselves in a world increasingly dominated by European empires. The Ethiopian war machine was unlike anything the world had seen from an African power. While European observers dismissed it as a collection of primitive tribesmen, the reality was far more sophisticated. Menelik had spent the better part of a decade transforming his military from a traditional feudal force into something approaching a modern army. Ethiopian agents had traveled across Europe, purchasing weapons from arms dealers in Russia, France, and even Italy itself. The irony was not lost on Menelik that Italian manufacturers had sold him many of the rifles his soldiers would soon turn against Italian troops. The emperor's strategy extended far beyond simply buying weapons. He had established armories in Addis Ababa where European firearms could be maintained and repaired. Ethiopian blacksmiths, working alongside captured European technicians, had learned to manufacture ammunition and even modify weapons to suit local conditions. When Italian intelligence reports reached Rome, describing Ethiopian forces armed with modern rifles. Military commanders dismissed these accounts as exaggerated. They could not conceive of Africans possessing such organizational capability. But perhaps the most crucial element of Menelik's preparation was his understanding of logistics. European armies in Africa typically relied on long supply lines stretching back to coastal ports. These lines were vulnerable to disruption and required massive resources to maintain. Menelik, fighting on his own territory, had turned this European advantage into a weakness. His forces could live off the land, supplied by a population that saw them as liberators rather than occupiers. Every village, every mountain path, every water source was part of an intelligence network that kept Ethiopian commanders informed of Italian movements while leaving the invaders blind to Ethiopian preparations. The Empress Teitu deserves particular recognition for her role in these preparations. Far from being merely a ceremonial figure, she had proven herself a skilled military strategist and diplomat. Her network of spies and informants stretched across the Horn of Africa, providing Menelik with detailed intelligence about Italian plans and capabilities. When Italian agents attempted to bribe Ethiopian nobles or spread dissension within the empire, they found themselves facing Teitu's counterintelligence operations. She had also played a crucial role in the diplomatic maneuvering that preceded the war, helping to secure weapons shipments and ensuring that potential rivals within Ethiopia remained loyal to Menelik's cause. As the armies converged on Adwa, the landscape itself became a factor in the unfolding drama. The northern Ethiopian highlands are among the most challenging terrain on Earth for military operations. Jagged peaks rise to over 10,000 feet, separated by deep valleys and treacherous passes. Rivers that flow gently in the dry season can become raging torrents after sudden downpours. Roads that seem passable in daylight become death traps in darkness. This was terrain that Ethiopians had fought over for centuries, where their ancestors had repelled Ottoman invasions and Egyptian expeditions. General Baratieri, despite his experience in colonial warfare, found himself operating in conditions unlike any he had previously encountered. His maps were often inaccurate, based on sketchy European surveys that bore little resemblance to the actual topography. His supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to the coast, vulnerable to Ethiopian raiders who knew every mountain path and hidden valley. Most critically, his intelligence about Ethiopian capabilities remained woefully inadequate. Italian officers continued to believe they were facing a collection of spear-carrying tribesmen, even as reports filtered back from forward scouts describing disciplined Ethiopian units armed with modern weapons. The Italian advance had been marked by a series of smaller engagements that should have warned Baratieri of what lay ahead. At Amba Alagi, Ethiopian forces had demonstrated their ability to coordinate complex attacks against fortified positions. At Mekelle, Italian garrison forces had been besieged and forced to surrender after running out of water. These defeats were explained away in Italian military circles as the result of local conditions or tactical errors. The possibility that they faced a truly formidable opponent was dismissed as inconceivable. Meanwhile, Menelik's intelligence network provided him with detailed reports of Italian movements, strengths, and weaknesses. Ethiopian agents had infiltrated Italian camps, counting weapons and assessing morale. Captured Italian documents revealed the enemy's operational plans and supply situation. Most importantly, Ethiopian commanders understood that time was on their side. The longer the campaign dragged on, the more stretched Italian supply lines would become, while Ethiopian forces could continue to draw on local resources and reinforcements. The psychological dimension of the approaching battle was equally important. For the Italians, this was another colonial campaign in a long series of such operations. Victory was expected, resistance was temporary, and the outcome was never really in doubt. Individual soldiers might die, but the cause was just another step in the civilizing mission that European powers believed they were bringing to Africa. The stakes, while real for the men involved, were ultimately limited. Italy would survive regardless of the outcome in Ethiopia. For the Ethiopians, this battle represented something entirely different. This was a fight for the survival of their nation, their culture, their very identity as a free people. Every warrior who marched toward Adwa carried with him the weight of 1,000 years of independence. They fought not just for Menelik, but for the memory of their ancestors and the future of their children. In their minds, Defeat would mean the end of Ethiopia, as they had always known it. Victory would prove that Africans could stand as equals with any nation on earth. Religious fervor added another layer to Ethiopian motivation. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had declared the war against Italy a holy crusade, blessing the weapons of Menelik's warriors and calling upon divine intervention to protect the Christian kingdom. Priests accompanied the army, conducting services before battle and carrying sacred relics believed to ensure victory. The Ark of the Covenant, which Ethiopian tradition claimed had been brought to their land by the Queen of Sheba, was said to march with Menelik's forces. Whether or not soldiers literally believed these claims, the psychological impact was undeniable. As the final days of February slipped away, both armies completed their preparations for the decisive confrontation. Italian forces occupied positions around the small town of Adwa, confident that their superior firepower and European military doctrine would carry the day. Ethiopian warriors, drawn from every corner of their ancient empire, took up positions in the surrounding mountains, ready to defend their homeland against foreign conquest. The stage was set for a battle that would shatter assumptions about African military capability and send shockwaves across the colonial world. The dawn of the 1st of March, 1896, broke crisp and clear over the Ethiopian highlands. Mist clung to the valleys below Adwa as the first rays of sunlight caught the glint of rifle barrels and the flutter of battle standards. The air carried the sound of drums echoing between the mountains, the rhythm of Ethiopian war chants mixing with the sharper notes of Italian bugles. After months of maneuvering, skirmishing, and preparation, the moment of decision had finally arrived. General Baratieri had positioned his forces on what he believed was advantageous ground. His plan was typically European in its conception, relying on disciplined volleys, coordinated artillery fire, and the shock value of a determined advance. The Italian commander divided his army into 3 main columns, each tasked with seizing key positions around Adwa before converging on the town itself. On paper, it was a sound strategy that had worked countless times across Africa. In practice, it was about to encounter the harsh reality of fighting an enemy that refused to follow European expectations. The first column, under General Albertone, was assigned to capture the mountain of Kidan Meret. The second, led by General Dabromida, would take the heights of Belar. The third, commanded by General Arimondi, was to secure the center and coordinate the final assault. Each column numbered several thousand men, armed with modern rifles and supported by artillery pieces that had proven devastatingly effective against traditional African forces. What the Italian commanders failed to appreciate was that they were advancing into a carefully prepared trap. Menelik had not simply assembled a large army at Adwa. He had created a sophisticated defensive system that used the mountainous terrain to maximum advantage. Ethiopian forces were positioned to allow Italian columns to advance into predetermined killing zones, where superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the ground would neutralize European technological advantages. The emperor had studied reports of Italian tactics from their earlier campaigns, noting their tendency to divide forces and rely on firepower rather than maneuver. His battle plan was designed to exploit these predictable patterns. As Italian columns began their advance in the pre-dawn darkness, they immediately encountered problems that their maps had not prepared them for. The terrain was far more difficult than anticipated, with hidden ravines, false peaks, and paths that seemed to lead nowhere. Units became separated from their parent formations. Communications broke down as runners lost their way in the maze of valleys and ridges. By the time the sun rose fully, what should have been coordinated attacks had devolved into isolated advances by confused and increasingly desperate formations. The Ethiopian response was swift and devastating. From positions carefully chosen over weeks of preparation, Menelik's warriors opened fire on the scattered Italian columns. These were not the wild, undisciplined volleys that European officers expected from African fighters. These were controlled, accurate bursts of fire from soldiers who had been trained in modern military techniques and were fighting for their homeland. The sound of rifle fire echoed and re-echoed between the mountains, creating a deafening cacophony that shattered Italian confidence along with their battle formations. General Albertone's column, advancing toward Kidan Meret in the early morning darkness, walked directly into the heaviest concentration of Ethiopian forces. Led by Rasa Lula, one of Ethiopia's most experienced military commanders. These warriors had spent the night moving into position along the slopes above the Italian line of advance. When the attack came, it was not the frontal assault that European military doctrine anticipated. Instead, Ethiopian forces struck from multiple directions simultaneously, using the broken terrain to approach within close range before opening fire. The Italian soldiers, many of them colonial recruits from Eritrea fighting alongside Italian regulars, found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. These Ethiopian warriors moved with the confidence of men fighting on familiar ground. They used cover effectively, coordinated their attacks with precision, and displayed a level of military discipline that shattered every assumption about African military capability. Within minutes, Albertone's column was in full retreat, leaving behind their wounded, their supplies, and much of their equipment. Meanwhile, General Dabomida's force was discovering that the heights of Belar were already occupied by Ethiopian defenders who had no intention of giving ground. Led by Ras Mikhail, these fighters had transformed the mountain into a fortress, using natural rock formations as breastworks and establishing overlapping fields of fire that turned any approach into a deadly gauntlet. Italian attempts to storm the position met with withering volleys that cut down entire companies. The promised artillery support proved largely ineffective against defenders who knew exactly when to take cover and when to return fire. At the center of the developing disaster, General Aramondi's forces found themselves caught between the retreat of their flanking columns and the advance of fresh Ethiopian units that seemed to appear from every direction. What had begun as a coordinated assault was rapidly becoming a desperate fight for survival. Italian officers, trained in European military academies and experienced in colonial warfare, discovered that none of their previous experience had prepared them for this moment. They were fighting an enemy that combined modern weapons with traditional tactics, European military technology with African knowledge of terrain and climate. The battle reached its climax as Emperor Menelik himself led a massive charge against the crumbling Italian center. Mounted on his war horse and flanked by his imperial guard, the emperor presented a figure that seemed to embody the spirit of Ethiopian resistance. Behind him came wave after wave of warriors, their battle cries echoing across the battlefield as they surged forward with irresistible momentum. This was not the disorganized rush of primitive tribesmen that Italian military manuals had described. This was a coordinated assault by disciplined soldiers fighting for their freedom. The psychological impact on Italian forces was immediate and catastrophic. Soldiers who had been confident of victory just hours earlier now found themselves facing the very real possibility of annihilation. The retreat began as individual soldiers abandoned their positions. Within minutes, it had become a rout as entire units broke and fled toward the rear. Officers who tried to rally their men found themselves abandoned as panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. General Baratieri, watching his carefully planned offensive collapse from his command position, made the agonizing decision to order a general retreat. But retreat in the face of a victorious enemy is among the most difficult military maneuvers to execute successfully. The broken terrain that had hindered the Italian advance now became a death trap for fleeing soldiers. Ethiopian warriors, energized by their success and intimate with every path and valley, pursued the retreating Italians with relentless determination. What followed was not merely a military defeat, but a complete catastrophe for Italian arms. Soldiers threw away their weapons to run faster. Officers abandoned their men to save themselves. Supply trains were captured intact, providing Ethiopian forces with enormous quantities of modern weapons and ammunition. The carefully constructed image of European military superiority, built up over decades of colonial conquests, crumbled in the space of a few hours on the slopes around Adwa. The casualty figures tell the story of the disaster that befell Italian forces. Of the approximately 20,000 men who had advanced that morning, nearly half became casualties. Over 7,000 Italian and colonial soldiers were killed outright. Another 1,500 were wounded. More than 3,000 were taken prisoner. Among the dead were General Aramondi and hundreds of Italian officers who had paid with their lives for their underestimation of Ethiopian military capability. In contrast, Ethiopian losses, while significant, were far lighter. Menelik's forces had achieved what military historians would later recognize as one of the most complete victories in the annals of warfare. But the significance of Adwa extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. News of the Ethiopian victory spread across Africa with unprecedented speed, carried by traders, pilgrims, and refugees from the colonial wars that were ravaging the continent. In villages from Senegal to Zimbabwe, Africans learned that European armies could be defeated, that the weapons and tactics of the colonial powers were not invincible, that resistance was possible. The psychological impact of this revelation cannot be overstated in a continent where European dominance had seemed absolute and permanent. The victory at Adwa transformed Ethiopia from a regional kingdom into a global symbol of resistance against colonial oppression. Emperor Menelik II had achieved what no other African leader had managed in the age of European expansion. He had not merely repelled an invasion, he had shattered the myth that European military superiority was inevitable and absolute. The rifles captured at Adwa, the prisoners marched through Addis Ababa, the Italian officers forced to acknowledge Ethiopian sovereignty, all served as proof that the colonial powers could be beaten by determined African resistance. In the years that followed, pilgrims from across Africa would journey to Ethiopia to witness the land that had never been conquered. Writers and intellectuals from the African diaspora would look to Menelik's victory as evidence that their ancestors were capable of greatness. The green, yellow, and red flag of Ethiopia would become a symbol of African independence, inspiring liberation movements from Ghana to Kenya. Even today, more than a century later, the Battle of Adwa stands as a testament to the power of unity, preparation, and unwavering determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The mountains around that small town in northern Ethiopia had witnessed more than a military engagement. They had seen the birth of modern African nationalism and the first crack in the colonial edifice that would eventually bring freedom to an entire continent.